This is part 33 of Good Omens. The London traffic system is many hundreds of times more complex than anyone imagines. This has nothing to do with influences, demonic or angelic. It's more to do with geography and history and architecture. Most of this works to people's advantage, although they never believe it. London was not designed for cars. Come to that, it wasn't designed for people. It just sort of happened. This created problems, and the solutions that were implemented became the next problems 5 or 10 or 100 years down the line. The latest solution had been the M25, a motorway that formed a rough circle around the city. Up until now, the problems had been fairly basic, things like it being obsolete before they had finished building it. Einsteinian tailbacks that eventually became tail forwards, that kind of thing. The current problem was that it didn't exist, not in normal human spatial terms anyway. The tailback of cars unaware of this or trying to find alternative routes to London stretched into the city center from every direction. For the first time ever, London was completely gridlocked. The city was one huge traffic jam. Cars in theory give you a terrifically fast method of traveling from place to place. Traffic jams, on the other hand, give you a terrific opportunity to stay still. And the rain and the gloom, while around you the cacophonous symphony of horns grew ever louder and more exasperated. Crowley was getting sick of it. He'd taken the opportunity to reread Aziraphale's notes and to thumb through Agnes Netter's prophecies and to do some serious thinking. His conclusions could be summarized as follows. 1. Armageddon was underway. 2. There was nothing Crowley could do about this. 3. It was going to happen in Tadfield, or to begin there at any rate. After that, it was going to happen everywhere. 4. Crowley was in hell's bad books. Not that hell had any other kind. 5. Aziraphale was, as far as could be estimated, out of the equation. 6. All was black, gloomy, and awful. There was no light at the end of the tunnel, or if there was, it was an oncoming train. 7. He might as well find a nice little restaurant and get completely and utterly pissed out of his mind while he waited for the world to end. 8. And that was where it all fell apart, because underneath it all, Crowley was an optimist. If there was one rock-hard certainty that had sustained him through the bad times, he thought briefly of the 14th century, then it was utter surety that he would come out on top, that the universe would look after him. Okay, so hell was down on him, so the world was ending, so the Cold War was over, and the Great War was starting for real. So the odds against him were higher than a vanload of hippies on a blotter full of Owlsley Old Original. There was still a chance. It was all a matter of being in the right place at the right time. The right place was Tadfield. He was certain of that, partially from the book, partially from some other sense in Crowley's mental map of the world. Tadfield was throbbing like a migraine. The right time was getting there before the end of the world. He checked his watch. He had 2 hours to get to Tadfield, although probably even the normal passage of time was pretty shaky by now. Crowley tossed the book into the passenger seat. Desperate times, desperate measures. He had maintained the Bentley without a scratch for 60 years. What the hell? He reversed suddenly, causing severe damage to the front of the red Renault 5 behind him, and drove up onto the pavement. He turned on his lights and sounded his horn. That should give any pedestrians sufficient warning that he was coming, and if they couldn't get out of the way, well, maybe it'd all be the same in a couple of hours. Maybe. Probably. Hi-ho, said Anthony Crowley, and just drove anyway. There were 6 women and 4 men, and each of them had a telephone and a thick wad of computer printout covered with names and telephone numbers. By each of the numbers was a penned notation saying whether the person dialed was in or out, whether the number was currently connected, and most importantly, whether or not anybody who answered the phone was avid for cavity wall insulation to enter their lives. Most of them weren't. The 10 people sat there, hour after hour, cajoling, pleading, promising, through plastic smiles. Between calls, they made notations, sipped coffee, and marveled at the rain flooding down the windows. They were staying at their posts like the band on the Titanic. If you couldn't sell double glazing in weather like this, you couldn't sell it at all. Lisa Morrow was saying, "Now if you'll only let me finish, sir. And yes, I understand that, sir. But if you only..." And then seeing that he just hung up on her, she said, "Well, up your snot face." She put down the phone. "I got another bath," she answered to her fellow telephone salesperson. She was well in the lead in the office daily, getting people out of the bath stakes, and only needed 2 more points to win the weekly Coitus Interruptus award. She dialed the next number on the list. Lisa had never pretended to be a telephone salesperson. What she really wanted to be was an international glamorous jet setter, but she didn't have the O levels. Had she been studious enough to get accepted as internationally glamorous jet setter or a dental assistant, her second choice of profession, or indeed anything other than a telephone salesperson in that particular office, she would have had a longer and probably more fulfilled life. Perhaps not a very much longer life, all things considered, it being the day of Armageddon, but several hours anyway. For that matter, all she really needed to do for a longer life was not ring the number she had just dialed, listed on her sheet as the Mayfair home of, in the best traditions of 10th hand mail order list, Mr. A.J. Cowley. But she had dialed, and she had waited while it rang 4 times, and she had said, "Oh, Potts, another answer phone," and started to put down the handset. But then something climbed out of the earpiece, something very big and very angry. It looked a little like a maggot, a huge angry maggot made of thousands and thousands of tiny little maggots, all withering and screaming, millions of little maggots, mouths opening and shutting in fury, and every one of them was screaming, "Crowley!" It stopped screaming, swayed blindly, seemed to be taking stock of where it was. Then it went to pieces. The thing split into thousands of withering gray maggots. They flowed over the carpet, up over the desks, over Lisa Morrow and her 9 colleagues, then flowed into their mouths, up their nostrils, into their lungs. They burrowed into flesh and eyes and brain and lights, reproducing wildly as they went, filling the room with a towering mess of withering flesh and gunk. The whole began to flow together, to congealate into one huge entity that filled the room from floor to ceiling, pulsing gently. A mouth opened in the mass of flesh, strands of something wet and sticky adhering to each of the not exactly lips, and Hoster said, "I needed that." Spending an hour trapped on an answerphone with only Aziraphale's message for company had not improved his temper. Neither did the prospect of having to report back to hell and having to explain why he hadn't returned a half hour earlier, and, more importantly, why he was not accompanied by Crowley. Hell did not go a bundle on failures. On the plus side, however, he at least knew what Aziraphale's message was. The knowledge could probably buy him his continued existence. And anyway, he reflected, if he was going to have to face the possible wrath of the Dark Council, at least it wouldn't be on an empty stomach. The room filled with thick, superfluous smoke. When it cleared, Hoster was gone. There was nothing left in the room but 10 skeletons picked quite clean of meat and some puddles of melted plastic, with, here and there, a gleaming fragment of metal that might once have been part of a telephone. Much better to have been a dental assistant. But to look on the bright side, all this only went to prove that evil contains the seeds of its own destruction. Right now across the country, people who would otherwise have been made just that little bit more tense and angry had been summoned from a nice bath and having their names mispronounced to them, were instead feeling quite untroubled and peace with the world. As a result of Hoster's action, a wave of low-grade goodness started to spread exponentially through the population, and millions of people who ultimately would have suffered minor bruises of the soul did not, in fact, do so. So that was all right. You wouldn't have known it was the same car. There was scarcely an inch of it undented. Both front lights were smashed. The hubcaps were long gone. It looked like the veteran of 100 demolition derbies. The pavements had been bad. The pedestrian underpass had been worse. The worst bit had been crossing the River Thames. At least he'd had the foresight to roll up all the windows. Still, he was here now. In a few hundred yards, he'd be on the M40, a fairly clear run-up to Oxfordshire. There was only one snag. Once more between Crowley and the open road was the M25, a screaming, glowing ribbon of pain and dark light. Not exactly an oxymoron. It's the color past ultraviolet. The technical term for it is infrared black. It can be seen quite easily under experimental conditions. To perform the experiment, simply select a healthy brick wall with a good run-up and lowering your head, charge. The color that flashes and bursts behind your eyes behind the pane just before you die is in for black. Odegra. Nothing could cross it and survive. Nothing mortal anyway. And he wasn't sure what it would do to a demon. It couldn't kill him, but it wouldn't be pleasant. There was a police roadblock in front of the flyover before him. Burnt-out wrecks, some still burning, testified to the fate of previous cars that had to drive across the flyover above the dark road. The police did not look happy. Crowley shifted down into second gear and gunned the accelerator. He went through the roadblock at 60. That was the easy bit. Cases of spontaneous human combustion are on record all over the world. One minute someone's quite happy chugging along with their life. The next there's a sad photograph of a pile of ashes and a lonely and mysterious uncharred foot or hand. Cases of spontaneous vehicular combustion are less well documented. Whatever the statistics were, they had just gone up by 1. The leather seat covers began to smoke. Staring ahead of him, Crowley fumbled left-handedly on the passenger seats for Agnes Nutter's nice and accurate prophecies, moved it to the safety of his lap. He wished she'd prophesied this. She had. It read, "A street of light will scream, the black chariot of the serpent will flame, and a queen will sing quick fill-verse songs no more." Most of the family had gone along with Gallantly Device, who wrote a brief monograph in the 1830s explaining it as a metaphor for the banishment of Wasserpup's Illuminati from Bavaria in 1785. Then the flames engulfed the car. He had to keep driving. On the other side of the flyover was a further police roadblock to prevent the passage of cars trying to come into London. They were laughing about a story that had just come over the radio that a motorbike cop on the M6 had flagged down a stolen police car only to discover the driver to be a large octopus. Some police forces would believe anything. Not the Metropolitan Police, though. The Met was the hardest, most cynical, pragmatic, most stubbornly down-to-earth police force in Britain. It would take a lot to phase a copper from the Met. It would take, for example, a huge battered car that was nothing more nor less than a fireball, a blazing, roaring, twisted metal lemon from hell, driving by a grinning lunatic in sunglasses sitting amid the flames, trailing thick black smoke coming straight at them through the lashing rain and the wind at 80 miles per hour. That would do it every time.